We are back with the final part, or the section of this part of Jean Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin. We are moving on to the integral structure now. Important. I know I say this a lot, but this video will be shorter than the other ones. The reason why is because I was actually shocked when I was going through and taking my notes for this video, how few pages he actually dedicates to the integral structure. And the reason for that is because that's what the entire second half of this book is. So we will be getting into it in painstaking detail later on in this series. So now we're going to outline, or we're going to go through the outlines of the structure, its incipient nature, what it is, what preceding discovery birthed it, and all that stuff. Now let's get into it. Of course, we finished with the mental structure, and we are moving out of it. And I think I could be wrong, but the integral structure, I think, started to rise around 1800 maybe, or the 1900. The 20th century is starting to rise, but rationalism likes to fight against it because it claims exclusivity. Let's get into it now. In the first sentence, he says, but not all acquiesce to the separation postulated by Descartes. His division of mind and matter that are linked together in primordial kinship. This is of decisive importance with respect to the manifestations of a new consciousness structure, for these manifestations indicate that the specific consciousness mutation is occurring in man from which the aperspectival world can take shape. So we have Descartes' dualism, mind, matter. Not everyone followed that. There are people who are not rationalists, whether consciously or subconsciously. They broke free or separated from this deficient dualism that we covered in the mental structure. He said, yet even mention of these indications can give rise to misunderstandings, since the relationship of each individual inception to the integral consciousness structure now emerging is not immediately apparent from our discussion so far. It is nonetheless our intent to outline the foundation of the integral structure with sufficient distinctness so that its nature, like any foundation, reveals itself as the specific basis of the structure under construction. So that's what a lot of this video is going to be about, going through the manifestations of the integral consciousness structure and how they differ from the perspectival world. Now we're in the aperspectival world. So that's a lot of this section is going to be about that. In this instance, however, it is not evidence merely a spatial, it is nonetheless, never mind, I apologize. In this instance, however, it is not evidence merely a spatial but also a specifically temporal character that renders it quite distinct from the traditional notion of a structure, even from a purely structural viewpoint. Pop quiz. The magic conscious structure was birthed from the discovery of nature. The mythical conscious structure was birthed from the discovery of the soul, the internal, the psyche, if you insist. The mental conscious structure was birthed from the discovery of space, of the objectified world. And now the aperspectival world, the integral consciousness structure, is birthed from the discovery of time. More accurately, space-time. Later on in the book, Gebser will say space is a time creates space. Time is you can't have one without the other. It is space-time. It is not just time separate from space. Space-time time is a constitutive of space. It is a creator of space. In order to engage with space, you must necessarily be engaging with time. And he makes it clear that time, even though it is connected to space, it is still a separate problem. You cannot view time as I need to kill time, I need to fill time. No, time is not a spatial object like the mental world will have you believe, where you can fill things, you can kill things. It's just not going to happen. And there you go. Now, they said the new structure, moreover, cannot be realized by a reactivation of those structures underlying it. This contradicts, it is true, the two basic conceptions current today that form the polar field of tension of our contemporary perspectivistic world, the natural and human sciences on the one hand, and the occult sciences on the other. It is regrettable that each of these sides maintains a claim of exclusivity and, equally regrettable, that they lack insight into their mutual duality and antagonistic interdependence. Their dualistic, antithetical character is patently obvious. On the one hand, the natural sciences, with the human and social sciences closely modeled on their example, and on the other, the sciences of the occult. The one group is exclusively forward-directed, of course that's science, and the other almost exclusively backward-oriented. The one emphasizes today the quantitative aspect, the other ostensibly the qualitative. The one is predominantly materialistic, the other psychistic or psychological. The one is intent on fragmenting everything, the other on unifying. Then, too, the one side seeks salvation in synthesis or in some kind of third entity, as in the Third Reich, or a third way, or a third humanism, Thomas Mann. Notice the trinity, notice the triangular thought here, rational. We're in the perspectival world, science. The other envisions salvation in a retrogressive unification, thereby activating deficient mythical and magical forms to a degree that most adherents of Western traditionalism are devalued into a psychistic and magical state as a result of their mentality, a state at best of complete engulfment in the cosmos. And there is on the one side a surrender of the sovereignty of the mind via a kind of rational dissolution that, in supra-rational form, has an atomizing effect on matter. On the other, a surrender of the mind's sovereignty, a sovereignty appropriate to our civilization that is acquired in the course of millennia via return to the irrational, and a rational dissolution that in dementalized form has an atomizing effect on the psyche and the mind. Problems with the rational dualistic form, one or the other. A, Z, they cannot be both. They are always in opposition to each other and antithetical. But what you're doing in that is you're separating the whole into little halves. And both of these sciences have efficient aspects and deficient aspects. And when you have a one or the other, what you're doing is you are sectoring off the efficient and deficient aspects of the other. And in doing so, you're no longer feeling the boon or the gain or the benefit of the efficient, and you are feeling the pain and the negative consequences of the deficient because you're just not taking it into account. You view the other stuff as complete nonsense. The scientists view the occultists as irrational morons who just shouldn't be involved in society, really, in terms of actually getting things done. Then the occultists view them as little more than the personification. They're not even really human. They're just the personification of rationality, and they can't see that they're blind to the destruction they cause. And there's a whole world outside of rationality that confers its own benefits. So that's a big problem. But he says, none of these routes is passable. All paths lead only to where they have led away from. Either we run in a circle, inexorably confined and imprisoned, or we run to and fro from one opposite to the other in the belief that in the compulsive back and forth we will find a synthesis. What is needed then is not a way or a path, but a leap. It is the general insecurity of today an indication that we are, quote unquote, on the mark or about to leap? The depths of the abyss are visible only when one leaps across. Beautiful line there. But it is no longer enough to reach or jump to the other side. So how do we get out of this deficient one or the other rationalist nonsense? This is the problem, okay? So when I spoke earlier, it was either in my Kill Rationalism video or the Mental Consciousness Structure video, I talked about how Derrida noticed what he called the logocentric age. Logo, of course, meaning order being tied with rationality and reason, which beginning with Plato, there was binaries posited, metaphysical binaries, nature, culture, speech, writing, political left, political right, society, the individual, all sorts of things. And of course, one was privileged over the other. I went through this in my mental consciousness structure video or in the rationalism. Please watch those. But in doing so, beginning with Plato, because we're in the mental consciousness structure, the one of the binaries that was always privileged was always the one that was most rational, that made most rational sense. In doing so, what you've done is you've privileged rationality, but at the direct expense of lowering irrationality. So it's the seesaw. And I actually came up with this metaphor on my own, and I think he confirms it later on, or he already did, but I was proud of myself. I think of a couple things as I'm reading it, and then 10 pages later, he says the same thing. So that's always a good sign. But it's the seesaw. So now we have a reversion back to irrationality. So we're tired of your brutally cold, mechanical, meaningless murder of meaning that we exist in the world. Everything is scientific, cold, evolutionary. We don't want this. This kills the human soul, the human spirit. We're done with that. Okay, so we go back to irrationality, but of course both of these are deficient. So now we live in the world of irrationality. We reject rationality, and now we have no medicine. We have no technology. We are constantly fighting. Yeah, we might have a little more meaning in our lives, but we don't have all these other great benefits that the world of rationality has conferred upon us. Once one is privileged, the other one gets repressed, and then it will come back, and then the seesaw turns. But what happens? So we start with rationality. rationalism, I should say. We rejected that for all the reasons I've explained. So we say, okay, we only have one or the other, so we go back to irrationality. But that also has its own problems, and you shouldn't do that. What he's saying is, you don't do the seesaw. You break the seesaw and you leap forward into something else, because that is what happens. This is politically, you see this too. The left gets in, they do what they want. The right gets in, they would do what they want, because they are because both of these parties believe. Let's say the Republicans voted in with 52% of the vote. They will take that as a mandate from God to do what they want. And the left will do that too. The Democrats do it as well. So one of the parties goes too far, causes the other, they go too far, and now we do the seesaw, and we can never break out of this, and nothing can get done because we're all worried about laws changing and rules changing that simply ruin everything. We must make a leap. We do not regress to deficient irrationality, but we transcend to efficient irrationality. Very important. Break the seesaw. The fulcrum in the middle is what creates the seesaw. Focus on that, not the one or the other. All right. The concretion of time is one of the preconditions for the integral structure. Only the concrete can be integrated, never the merely abstract. By integration, we mean a fully completed and realized wholeness, the bringing about of an integrum, i.e., the reestablishment of the inviolate and pristine state of origin by incorporating the wealth of all subsequent achievement. What are we doing? The integral consciousness structure takes all the preceding consciousness structures, renders them transparent so we can understand their nature, understand their essence, understand their efficient and deficient aspects, take them all in, not privilege one or the other, and collect them into a balanced whole where each has their place. And in doing so, we will reattach ourselves to the pristine origin and the pristine feeling of unification that could have been found in the archaic or even the magical consciousness structures. But we're doing so with consciousness and with intelligence. But not just consciousness and intelligence. That's the whole point. It's different from the magic because the magic didn't have the ego. It didn't have natural temporicity of mythological consciousness structure. It didn't have the recognition of the internal. It didn't have any of that. It had unity, and we're trying to get back to that. But it didn't have any of that other stuff. Now, the integral consciousness structure takes all of that and it combines it or compiles it into a balanced whole. That is the integral consciousness structure. We are rendering all the other conscious structures transparent, learning about them, and then reestablishing them and combining them into a completed whole, and where none is privileged over the other. And if one is privileged over the other, it's only because of specific contingent circumstances. That is it a time for me to be rational? Is it a time for me to be mythical? Is it a time for me to be magical? Then I'll privilege magic. Then I'll privilege myth. Then I'll privilege rationality. But unless it's something like that, no, we have a balanced whole where all the structures are balanced, and in doing so, we reattach ourselves to the unity of the archaic structure. That's a big deal. Let's see. The concretion of everything that is unfolded in time and coalesced in a spatial array is the integral attempt to reconstitute the magnitude of man from his constituent aspects so that he can consciously integrate himself with the whole. This is big. The integrator then is compelled to have not only concretized the appearances, be they material or mental, but also to have been able to concretize his own structure. This means that the various structures that constitute him must have become transparent and conscious to him. That is big. The various structures within you and all they created you have now have a conscious understanding of them, and they have become transparent. That's how you know you've achieved integral conscious structure or integral consciousness. It also means that he has perceived their effect on his life and destiny and mastered the deficient components by his insight so that they acquire the degree of maturity and equilibrium necessary for any concretion. Again, this is not just a way to understand history. This is a way to improve your personal life. Whoever's watching this, you are an individual. You can improve your life because you are being a slave to all these aspects of the human condition that you just don't know exist. And I didn't know they existed until I read this. That's why I'm trying to get the word out there. Recognize, hey, I'm being overcome by anger. This is deficient magical nonsense. I don't need this. Hey, I'm being way too qualitative and interpretive in an area where we should be being rational. This is deficient mythical. Once you have knowledge of this, you can understand and sort of rework things, and now character issues can be more easily overcome. And like you said, your fate and destiny, you can build a new road to walk down. And instead of the road walking to hell, you can walk it to heaven. I'm not a Christian, but let's see. Only those components that are in this way themselves balanced, matured, and mastered concretions can affect an integration. The difficulty, and we will return to this in the next chapter, is that in every instance we are necessarily dealing with the ability of our faculty of consciousness to adapt itself to the different degrees of consciousness of the various structures. Now, as a state of deep sleep is characteristic of the archaic structure, a sleep-like state for the magic, a dream-like state for the mythical, and a wakefulness for the mental, a mere conscious illumination of these states, which are for the most part only dimly conscious, does not achieve anything. In fact, to illuminate these states from consciousness is to destroy them. Only when they are integrated via a concretion can they become transparent in their entirety and present, or diaphanous. Oh, in their present. What the hell? Only when they are only when they are integrated via a concretion can they become transparent in their entirety and present, or diaphanous. It was a very odd sentence that you wrote there. So simple knowledge about this isn't enough. You have to. It's think of the difference between paying lip service and taking something seriously. The psyche has to resonate with the psyche. The psyche has to concretize that knowledge and say, no, this is not just some advice that my grandfather gave me 8 years ago. This is real. This is as real as anything in the physical world, and I'm taking this wholly seriously. That is what will sort of free you from deficient rationalism. You have to take it seriously. You can't just say, no, this is just a meta-narrative, stupid, and these are just emotions. That's not going to help you at all. You must take them seriously. He says, a mere conscious illumination of these states, which are for the most part only dimly conscious, does not achieve anything. In fact, to illuminate these states from consciousness is to destroy them. So, I actually wonder what he means by that. To illuminate. We'll get there later in the book. All right, there are two important consequences that indirectly result from these observations. One is that consciousness is not identical with intelligence or rational acuity. We'll get there later in the book. The other is that the completion of integration is never an expansion of consciousness as spoken of today, particularly by psychoanalysis and certain spiritual societies of a quasi-occult kind. The expansion of consciousness is merely a spatially conceived quantification of consciousness and consequently an illusion. When things are expanding, if consciousness is expanding, well, that you're presupposing a spatial object there. There's a spatial object that starts at this, then it expands, now it's this, and now it's that. That's not what this is. That's deficient rationalism. Rather, we are dealing here throughout with an intensification of consciousness. It's big. We'll get that actually in the next chapter, so don't get confused. But the point is, you don't want just a bunch of different mutation consciousness structures, because they rework things and rearrange things, and now there's no room for wholeness. But we'll explain later. All right. Now he says, let us, however, by way of conclusion, return to the indications of the integral structure mentioned above. Now we're getting into the manifestations. It was none other than a pupil of Leonardo da Vinci who went beyond the limitations of perspectival spatialization. We refer, of course, to Jacopo da Pontormo, and specifically with reference to some of his portraits. Here we can define more intensively than before the distinguishing aspect of the portraits. Despite Pontormo's use of perspectival techniques, the gaze of the people in his portraits does not correspond to the perspectival age. Their gaze is not fixed within spatial limits, but is, on the contrary, depicted with reference to time. It goes beyond the spatial confines of the picture rather than being focused on or turned on an actual or imaginary point within the picture. In this reference to time, which we should note occurs simultaneously with reference to space-time, is a point of departure for a possible temporic concretion of time. So if you want to look up Jacopo da Pontormo, if you want to look up some of his paintings, do that. And you can compare them to Da Vinci, and you can see the gaze of the eye, and you can pick up on what Gebser is saying. Now, I should say, I'm not going to pretend and lie and pretend I know anything about Pontormo or any of these guys. I'm learning just like you guys are. But the reason I'm saying this is because I'm trying to show that, again, there are different manifestations in all forms of human expression. And when you pick up on these very, very, very subtle details, you can, with evidence, realize, hey, a new structure is emerging. In 1636, Desargues published his Traité de la section perspective, followed significantly by his theory of conic sections in 1639. This was tantamount to an abandonment of a purely three-dimensional space in favor of spherical, solid, or filled space, leaving behind the emptiness of purely linear space, and touching the dimension of fulfillment that is a precondition of, at the very least, the latent presence of the temporals. Now remember, actually, I'll wait, because he does get into this. Oh, here we go, the next sentence. Here, too, we encounter for the first time the striking symbol of the integral structure, the sphere. We have the symbol for the magic is the dot, or the point. Then we have the 2D flat circle. Then we have the 3D triangle, the sectored circle. Now we have a sphere. Now it's fourth dimensional. Now it's no longer flat necessarily. It is three-dimensional, but it's also, it goes beyond that. It's four-dimensional. So to take a classic 3D object and then fill the empty space with content. That is 4D. Now I made the mistake of not drawing this out before doing that. I apologize, but just go on Google, pause this, look up 3D versus 4D, and then you'll see it. It's very interesting. So he says, in favor of spherical, solid, or filled space. Now remember, a huge critique of rationality and rationalism is its denuding of all meaning. It is deconstructs rationally all meaning systems, religion, art, psychology, dream interpretation, all that stuff. Soft forms of truth like poetry or the English language, great authors, Dostoevsky and all these guys. That gets rationalized away. At best, it's nice and it's nice entertainment, but now we're in the world of science. So when push comes to shove, we will be relying on the scientists. So the integral consciousness structure fills that empty space. And I think you're noticing today in 2025 a revival of spirituality. You certainly are with me. I was a little atheist logical, but you're starting to see a lot more people reject rationalism and their nihilism in favor of spirituality and meaning. The woke left, I think the reason why they go on, they tie themselves to this political movement, this narrative, is because, partly at least, because it provides them meaning, purpose. That's gone in deficient rationalism. Postmodernity has completely destroyed all of it. Now it's all oppressive knowledge structures. No one takes God any seriously anymore. Everyone mocks religion. No one really takes art seriously anymore. And if they did, what art do we have? We have Andy Warhol Brillo box nonsense, or we just have postmodern nonsense where some broad gets slapped in the face, or another guy pisses into the mouth of some guy on the street, and that's supposed to be art. Okay, or if they say, Da Vinci, Picasso, this is all traditional, oppressive. When you consider this good, that's oppressive. That's only one way. And then they just shove the ugliest and dirtiest and just most embarrassingly pathetic pieces of art. And when you say this is trash, they try to play some mind games on you. The point is that there's no meaning. But the integral consciousness structure provides meaning. It takes spirituality seriously, and it fills up that empty container that used to have meaning that rationalism took out. Why does it take spirituality seriously? Because it recognizes the deficient nature of rationalism, baby. Why would I use that when trying to attain knowledge of the other side? Doesn't make sense. There's more meaning and more spiritual transcendence and purpose in the integral structure than there is the mental consciousness structure. It's pretty, I think, easily explained. It is in fact a kind of signature for the four-dimensionality of this structure which we are to understand as a sphere in motion. It is significantly the 16-year-old Blaise Pascal who continued the conics of Desargues in his Essai pour les coniques, of 1640. The two treatises of Desargues, God, that's a terrible name, were of great consequence, as they established projective geometry at the very time that Descartes was setting down his analytic geometry. So it's not just art, it's geometry. We're going now to 4D geometry, not just 3D. As of course, now remember, when the Renaissance happened, we had the discovery of space, which led from 2D to 3D. So we went from 2D Euclidean geometry to 3D geometry in the Renaissance. Now we're going to 4D geometry. This projective geometry was freed by Christian von Stout. He called it positional geometry, from the last vestiges of debt to the old metric geometry remaining in the theories of Desargues and Pascal, which was based in part on Da Vincian perspective and part of Euclidean geometry. Metric geometry, once reigning supreme, became a mere appendix of projective geometry, which, in the words of M. Zacharias, set the elements in motion. Remember, the sphere is in motion. We're going 4D, and it's not just still. Now we're moving. Let's see. Points intersect lines, set the elements in motion. Points intersect lines, revolve around fixed points, or roll as tangents around curves, and planes revolve around fixed axes. It is the procedure of projective geometry that took into account the position of the elements and their respective motion to each other, and not the calculating process of analytic geometry that gained currency in validation. Let's repeat for emphasis. It is the procedure of projective geometry that took into account the position of the elements and their respective motion to each other, and not the calculating process of analytic geometry that gained currency in validation. Now, rational analysis, like I said earlier, takes the whole and divides things, but in doing so, it confers a static quality to the things that it's dividing. Now we're reuniting, and in reuniting, we're conferring motion. It's not just static like in the rational world, where you very slowly take it one by one, and you don't involve flux or dynamism or anything like that. But the integral structure does. Let's see. And following up upon Descartes and Desargues, after yet another generation, is Leibniz, his philosophy, who counters the dualism postulated, albeit ambivalently, in Descartes' treatise Les Passions des Âmes, in which the soul and the body, or the mind and matter respectively, were said to constitute their own worlds independently of each other. Dualism. We got soul and world. These are two separate things, and according to Descartes and rationality. It's not true. To this Leibniz responded, there is an exact correspondence between the body and all thoughts of the soul, whether they are reasonable or not. And dreams have their traces in the brain just as much as the thoughts of men awake. If we recall what we said regarding the interdependence of the soul or psyche and time in the section above on the mythical structure, then this interdependence of soul and time as granted and established in mental terms by Leibniz may be considered evidence that the very recognition of the temporal psychic constituents constitutes a temporic point of departure for the later concretion of time. So we're bringing time back in, but the very recognition of the temporal psychic constituents constitutes a temporic point of departure for the later concretion of time. So, of course, in the mental structure, we weren't necessarily looking in time or the psyche because those aren't rationally accounted for. We were focusing on the external world and space. Now we're bringing time and the psyche back in, just like the the mythical consciousness structure. But of course, this is different than that because we are integrating all structures into this. This holds true even though Leibniz conceives of the soul in terms of the prevailing zeitgeist as being attached to matter in the instance to the brain. Still another generation later, this is some fascinating stuff. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to pretend like I have some strong understanding of music. It's some fascinating stuff, in my opinion. Still another generation later, a new sense of time becomes evident with the advent of Mozart. We have mentioned in another context to what degree this is expressed in Don Giovanni and in the second movement of the Jupiter Symphony. Here we would point to one of his unfinished later works, the C minor Fantasy for piano, as well as to his variations on a theme of Gluck, based on Gluck's opera Del Palger von Mecca. In the C minor Fantasy, in particular, a harmonic as well as rhythmic melodic loosening up can be discerned that is far removed from the hierarchic strictness and dominance of the classical tradition. In order that the significance of this fact can be grasped, we should perhaps point out the significance of a basic rule of classical composition, namely, that every movement of a piece of music was supposed to close in the same key as it began. This requirement clearly demonstrates the relation between such music in the course of natural cosmic events. The circle must be completed. The principal subject ties the beginning and the end together by the same key. Consequently, every sonata movement was a reflection or image of a divinely created day or year, or of a planet returning upon itself in its orbit, or of the path of any other God-given celestial body. So in many ways, the beginning of the symphony and the ending of the symphony with the same key, it almost takes on that mythical aspect of the 2D flat circle. Things are always closing in on each other. The beginning and the end are kind of the same. Where did it go? Where did it go? This late music of Mozart simply breaches the naturalistic regularity that corresponded to the precepts of the law-giving creator god lauded and celebrated in tone, both as to the inner structure of the music as well as to its incompleteness and pervasive anguish. Is Mozart moving here from the ostensible realm of the perspectively fixed personified god into the realm of the divinitary? Is this the source of his early death? Interesting stuff. A contemporary of Mozart with similar audacity, Hölderlin, died even before his physical death. Be this as it may, the elimination of the purely natural time orientation of music, a literally unheard of achievement, bore the possibility of a temporal point of departure for a time concretion to be later fulfilled. So if you understand music, go back and check out those symphonies and see the differences. It takes a fine ear, obviously. Now, of course, the mental structure, which Gebser probably grew up in his whole life before he discovered this, the eye is the sense that is privileged. So the ear is sort of deprivileged, demoted. So I think Gebser was just like, well, let me close my eyes and really focus on my hearing, and he's able to pick out these subtle differences and nuances that I just simply never would be able to. I thought that was fascinating. So again, it's not just philosophy; it is different forms. The new way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other expresses itself in all forms of human expression, or manifests in all forms of human expression. So that's a lot of what this is. Let's see. Again, following the span of a generation, we meet up with a phenomenon in the works of Leopardi that has been traditionally misunderstood, but that seems to make sense in this context. Leopardi, as is evident from his Zibaldone and his diaries, is a thinker who elevates noia or boredom and celebrates it in his works. But this presence and acceptance of boredom could be said to be the negative manifestation today. We could call it the unconscious manifestation of the psyche pressing to manifest itself in time. This is the same individualistic psyche to which his contemporary Stendhal, the egotist, pays tribute via his psychological realism. Stendhal was one of the very first to take the positive step out of isolation and to discover his own inner world, the isolation described in his Arments having become effectual via his own ego banishment. Here once again, although in a different form, the creation of a new kind of relationship is evident, one which connects to the timeless temporal aspects of one's own psyche and not to the general or collective natural temporal soul. Once more, we find the point of departure for the possibility of a later time concretion. So this is interesting. So again, time is coming in, and it's not only a naturalistic understand of the sun will go down in a while. If you want to go, if we're mythical, man, and we're in 8000 BC, you have a natural understanding of temporality. The sun and lightness, darkness, they all fall into each other. You have a general rough sense of when that's going to be. But now we have a far greater understanding of time. Einstein comes in and I guess sort of solves time, figures out what time is on the physical realm. Heidegger comes in with being and time. Now we're understanding time on a more abstract level. And in turn, it's a more resonant and more concretized form of understanding of time. It's not just the simple, basic understanding of time that they had in the mythical consciousness structure. But you're seeing differences. We have time and the psyche coming back in. In the mental consciousness structure, it was the mind and the external. So bringing it all back. We can keep that, but we're bringing back in the internal and time. And our understanding of time is differentiated now. All right. This is actually the last paragraph. And to the extent that this concretion of time leads to a diaphanous present and to a transparent presence, some words of Hölderlin are appropriate. Hölderlin, who encountered the sun on his journey home from Bordeaux. Like Dante's teacher, Brunetto Latini, and later Van Gogh, he too encountered the great measure S, measure-ess of time. And we are perhaps justified in relating his words to the consciousness structure then emerging, which he anticipated in many respects. Hölderlin wrote, "Behold, it is the eve of time, the hour when the wanderers turn toward their resting place. One god after another is coming home. Therefore, be present." Integral consciousness structure understands time not as separation of past, present, future, but a recognition of a enduring and perpetual present in which past and future are combined into the present. Our past affects our present actions, and so does the future. These are not distinct, separate stages that negate one another. They are combined, just like the integral consciousness structure does to all of them. It's interesting you mentioned Holderlin. Holderlin was the one, Gebser was a fan of poetry, and Holderlin made these subtle changes that Gebser believed revealed a new way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other. And that was the spark that caused him to write this book. It was actually a poem for Holderlin. And I've actually got into some of his poems because he's become so highly recommended from Gebser. And there's some beautiful stuff in there. So please just go on ChatGPT. Just give me 10 of Holderlin's best poems. There's some great, great stuff. I think one of them was like, "He who does not find his divine right in life shall find no peace among the dead." It's just beautiful stuff like that. But that's integral consciousness structure for you there. Again, it's definitely not as long as the 3-hour lecture on the mental structure. But that's only because we'll be getting way more into it into the second half of the book. So you guys are the best. I love you guys. Thank you guys for commenting. I always try to engage with you guys. If you guys want to get on and talk about any of this stuff, let me know and we'll work it out. So I will see you guys soon. And then we're done with the 4 structures now. We're done with the 4 structures, and that's great. Honest to God, I obviously want you to keep going. You could stop at the end of the integral and you would know more than 99% of these people. Even the academics, they have no idea what they're doing. They're in the water. They're all rationalists. They're all in the water. They haven't been taken out of the water, but you have. I've taken you out of the water. Now you can understand people's mode of thought better than they do. And you can understand this change of rejecting rationality, but unfortunately we're doing that to revert back to deficient irrationality. You don't want to do that. You want to transcend to efficient irrationality, and that is what I'm trying to do. So thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys soon. You guys are the best.